Hello friends, welcome to my channel Heartbreak Stories. I invite you to take a walk with me along the waterfront and listen to a new and interesting story. Let's go.
Some people go to war and come back changed. That's just the truth. And sometimes the hardest battle isn't the one overseas. It's the one waiting for you at home, in your own living room, with the person you trusted most. Today's story is about a man who carried more than most people ever will, and discovered that the enemy he never saw coming wasn't wearing a uniform. This is a story about betrayal, about silence, and about what a man does when everything he built starts falling apart around him. Stay with me, because this one is going to hit hard. Now let's listen to the story.
She said my PTSD was too much and walked out to a party. I let her go. When she came back the next morning with tears and excuses, something had already shifted inside me. Quietly, permanently. She thought she knew exactly who she was dealing with. She was wrong on every count. My name is Gilbert Dixon. I'm 42 years old, and I run a firearms and tactical training facility outside Raleigh, North Carolina. After 12 years in the infantry, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, I came home, got my certifications, and built something I was proud of. 35 students a week, law enforcement contracts, a solid reputation. On paper, my life looked like a success story. But paper doesn't tell you about the nights. The nightmare started maybe 8 months after my last deployment. At first they were manageable. A bad dream here, a cold sweat there. I'd wake up, drink some water, tell myself to get it together. That's what you do when you're wired the way I am. You push through. You don't talk about it. You definitely don't cry about it. I was a soldier. I trained people to handle pressure. Admitting that I was drowning felt like the worst kind of weakness. Paige, my wife, she tried in the beginning. She really did. She'd reach over in the night when I'd bolt upright, her hand on my arm, her voice soft. You okay? And I'd say yes. I always said yes. Because saying no meant opening a door I didn't know how to open. We'd been married 11 years by then. We met when I was 29, already a staff sergeant, already a little roughed up around the edges, but still capable of being the man she thought she was marrying. She was 26, working for a tech startup downtown, sharp as a tack, funny in that dry way that caught you off guard. I fell hard. We had 8 and 2 years in. Life was full. Then the last tour changed something in me I haven't been able to change back. I want to be clear about something, because I've spent a lot of time in my own head about this. I was not easy to live with. I know that. The hypervigilance, the distance, the way I'd flinch at car doors slamming and spend 20 minutes afterward convincing myself I was fine. None of that made me a picnic. Paige bore a lot of that weight without complaining, or at least without complaining to me. But here's what I also know. Struggling doesn't give anyone the right to do what she did. Aiden was 10 when everything blew up. 4th grade, obsessed with baseball and NASA, had this gap-toothed grin that could turn a bad day around in an instant. He was the best thing we'd ever done together, and I want you to understand that everything that came after, every decision I made, every calculated move, I made with him at the center of it. I started noticing changes in Paige maybe 3 months before the party. Nothing I could put my finger on right away. She started going to the gym after work instead of before. Started taking her phone into the bathroom. Got new clothes, not flashy but different. Younger somehow. I chalked it up to a phase. Maybe she was feeling good about herself. Maybe the IT company was doing team events. I was too deep in my own fog to push. Doug Farrell was my closest friend. We've been buddies since we both got out and tried to figure out what civilians actually did with their Saturdays. He'd come by the range sometimes, grab a beer after. He had a good read on people, or at least I thought he did. One evening in early October, we were sitting on my back porch, and he looked at me sideways and said, "You doing okay, Gil?" Like actually okay. I told him I was fine. He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. That was Doug's way. He'd open the door and leave it open, but he wouldn't drag you through it. I appreciated that at the time. Later I'd wonder if he was opening that door for reasons that had nothing to do with my well-being. The nightmares that week were bad. Military imagery bleeding into domestic scenes in ways that made no sense, and every kind of sense. Sand and smoke and Paige's face in places it didn't belong. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart hammering and lie there in the dark listening to her breathe, trying to separate what was real from what wasn't. She'd stopped asking if I was okay. I told myself that was because she was tired, adjusting. that we were in a rough patch, the kind every long marriage goes through. I convinced myself we were going to come out the other side. I was wrong. We weren't in a rough patch. We were standing on the edge of something, and only one of us knew it. It was a Friday night in late October when Paige told me she was going out. She said it the way you announce something that isn't up for discussion, standing at the bathroom mirror, earrings already in, dressed in a dark green top I'd never seen before. Not asking, informing. "Co-workers are doing a thing downtown," she said, leaning closer to the mirror to check her lipstick. "I won't be late." I was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in my range clothes, smelling like gun oil and chalk dust after a full day of training a law enforcement group. I looked at her reflection and felt that familiar low-grade unease settle in my chest. "Which co-workers?" I asked. She gave a small shrug, the kind that means the answer doesn't matter and she'd prefer I not pursue it. "People from the project team. You don't know them." I let a beat of silence pass. "You've been going out a lot lately." Paige turned from the mirror and looked at me directly then, not warmly, not with patience. There was something sharper underneath, something she was keeping just barely contained. "Gilbert." She said my full name the way people do when they want you to hear a warning wrapped in politeness. "I love you, but living with your PTSD is exhausting. I need a night where I'm not walking on eggshells. I need to just be a person for a few hours. Can you understand that?" The words landed like a flat stone dropped in still water. I felt the ripple move through me, but I kept my face neutral. Years of field work will do that to you. Teach you to receive impact without showing it. "Go ahead," I said quietly. She grabbed her purse, squeezed my shoulder once, more habit than affection, and walked out. I heard the garage door open and close. Then silence. I sat there for a while, not moving. Aiden was already in bed, a school night, and the house had that hollow quality it gets when something important has just left it. I replayed her words. Living with your PTSD is exhausting. Maybe it was true. Maybe I'd been carrying so much weight that I'd transferred the load onto her without realizing it. That thought burrowed in and stayed. By 10 o'clock, she hadn't texted. By 11:30, still nothing. I'm not a man who sits still well under uncertainty. Combat trained that out of me years ago. Uncertainty is a threat vector until proven otherwise. I picked up my phone twice to text her and put it back down twice. I was not going to be that husband. I was not going to check up on her like she was a suspect. But something was pulling at me. Something with teeth. At midnight, I grabbed my jacket and my keys. I told myself I was just driving, getting air. The kind of thing I did when the walls of the house pressed too close. But my hands knew where they were going before my mind admitted it. I'd heard her mention the bar, Callaway's on Fayetteville Street. Offhand, weeks ago, the way people drop details they think you're not tracking. I parked 2 blocks away. Walked the rest. The place was lit up, spilling noise onto the sidewalk. I didn't go in. I positioned myself across the street, partially behind a parked delivery truck, and watched the entrance the way I'd watched 100 doorways in places that were a lot less forgiving than downtown Raleigh. I didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes. Maybe 20. Then Paige came out the front door with a man I'd never seen in my life. Tall, well-built, dark jacket. The easy confidence of someone who was comfortable taking up space. They were laughing. Not the polite, coworker kind of laughing. The loose, familiar kind. The kind that comes from shared history. She touched his arm. He leaned in and said something close to her ear. She laughed again, tilting her head back. And in 11 years of marriage, I could not remember the last time I'd seen her look that unguarded. Then he put his hand on the small of her back, and she didn't move away. I stood there long enough to file the image permanently, then turned and walked back to my truck. Steady steps, controlled breathing. The same discipline I'd used walking away from things that were a lot more dangerous than this. I drove home, put my phone face down on the kitchen counter, locked the back door, sat down in my chair in the dark living room, and did not move for a long time. When Paige came home at nearly 2 in the morning, she found the bedroom door closed and locked. She knocked twice, softly. I didn't answer. She tried my phone. I'd switched it to silent. After a while, I heard her go to the guest room. Good. The next morning, I was up before anyone else, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my thoughts organized like a tactical briefing. By the time Paige came downstairs looking uncertain and slightly pale, I had my face completely under control. I said nothing, just looked at her, then back at my coffee. Gilbert, she started. I stood up, rinsed my mug, and walked to the garage to get ready for work. Behind me, I heard her call my name again, louder this time, a note of panic starting to creep in at the edges. I let the door close between us. Let her wonder. Let her sit with the silence the way I'd been sitting with mine for months. For once, I was the one who walked away first. She came to the door at 9:15 the next morning. I was in the kitchen making Aiden's breakfast when the knocking started. Not aggressive, but insistent, the kind that says I know you're in there and I'm not leaving. Aiden looked up from his cereal. I told him to go get his backpack, that I'd drive him to school in 20 minutes. He disappeared down the hallway, and I walked to the front door and opened it. Paige stood on the porch in yesterday's makeup. Mascara tracked down both cheeks, eyes swollen and red. She'd been crying for a while. Her hands were twisting the strap of her purse like she was trying to wring something out of it. Gilbert, please. Her voice was raw. Can we talk? I looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Behind her, the October morning was bright and cold and indifferent. I stepped aside and let her in. She came in and immediately started explaining how she'd tried calling, how she'd been up all night worrying, how she'd never meant for any of this to happen. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself a second cup of coffee. Let her follow me. Let her keep talking. You saw something, she said finally, stopping in the kitchen doorway. At the bar, didn't you? Not a question. She'd worked it out overnight. I turned around and leaned against the counter, cup in both hands, and looked at her steadily. Tell me about him. Her chin trembled. It's not what you think. Paige. My voice came out measured, almost quiet. I spent 12 years in environments where people lied to survive. I know what a lie sounds like before the first word clears your teeth. Don't do that to me. She pressed her hands to her face, breathed, then dropped them. His name is Bryce. He's a contractor the company brought in for a project rollout. It's been a few months. I didn't plan it. It just happened. I finished for her. Right. Gilbert, I haven't been okay. Her voice rose, desperation threading through it. You're not here. You're in the house, but you're somewhere else entirely, always somewhere else. And I've been trying to hold everything together, and I just needed someone to actually see me. There was a time those words would have gutted me, made me feel like the failure she was describing. I felt the familiar pull of that, the PTSD guilt, the self-doubt, the voice that said she's right. You drove her here. But I pressed it down. I knew what she was doing, even if she didn't fully know she was doing it. So, when Aiden asked where you were last night, I said evenly, what do you want me to tell him? She flinched like I'd struck her. Don't bring Aiden into this. You brought him in the second you walked out that door. I set my coffee down. He's 10 years old, and he's already reading the temperature of this house every single morning when he comes downstairs. Kids know things, Paige. They always know. She started crying again, harder this time. Said she'd go to therapy, that we could fix it. That Bryce didn't mean anything. The usual architecture of damage control. I let her finish. Then I picked up my keys from the counter. I'm taking Aiden to school, I said. When I get back, I want you gone until we can have this conversation like two adults instead of one person confessing and one person auditioning for sympathy. She grabbed my arm. Gilbert, please don't shut me out. I know I hurt you, but don't do this to our family. I gently removed her hand, looked her in the eye. You did this to our family, Paige. Not me. I drove Aiden to school, shook his shoulder affectionately when he got out, and watched him walk through those doors. Then I sat in the parking lot with the engine running and let myself feel it, the full weight of it, for exactly 5 minutes. Jaw tight, knuckles white on the wheel. Then I put the truck in drive, because falling apart was not an option. Not yet. Not until I knew everything. 2 days after Paige's tearful appearance at the door, I got the text. I was at the range, running a private session with a retired detective, when my phone buzzed on the table beside the lane. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick it up. You don't know me. My name doesn't matter right now. But you need to know what's actually going on with your wife and Bryce Steele. What you saw at that bar is the surface. There's a lot more underneath. I can prove it. I kept my face calm, finished the session, and texted back when the detective was gone. How do you know about this? The reply came within minutes. Because I work with both of them. And because I've been watching this for 3 months, waiting to figure out if you knew. You didn't. So here we are. What followed over the next 2 hours came in pieces, screenshots, forwarded messages, timestamps. Each one landed like a round finding its target. The first set were text exchanges between Paige and Bryce going back to late January. Not just flirtatious, intimate in the way that means the physical part was already well underway. They'd been together since before my last reserve training cycle in February, which meant this had started while I was still home, while I was sitting across from her at dinner, while I was the man she said she was trying to reach. The second thing that stopped my breathing was a screenshot of a conversation where Paige described me to Bryce in terms I won't repeat in full. She called my PTSD episodes exhausting performances, said I used my military past as an excuse to avoid being a real husband, said she'd been mentally checked out of the marriage for over a year. Bryce's response was to agree, add a few choice observations of his own, and then ask what she was wearing. I read it twice, slowly, the way you read a casualty report. The third piece, bank transfer notifications. Bryce had been sending Paige money, not large sums, but regular. 200 here, 350 there, twice a month going back to March. The informant had photographed Paige's phone screen directly. There were also photos, Bryce's gifts, a bracelet, a weekend bag with a hotel logo on the tag. I sat in my truck in a range parking lot for a long time. Then I texted back, "Why are you doing this?" There was a longer pause before the answer came. Because he did the same thing to someone I care about. Different woman, same pattern. He's done this before. I figured you deserve to know who you're actually dealing with. That told me several things. 1. This informant had personal stakes. 2. Bryce Steele was not some guy who lost his head over an attractive woman. This was behavior he repeated. 3. Whoever this person was, they weren't motivated by altruism alone. They had their own score to settle, and I was a useful instrument. I filed all of that away and replied, "I appreciate it. Don't disappear yet. I may need you." No response after that. But they didn't block me either. That evening I called Doug Farrell, kept it casual, mentioned I was dealing with some stress. He offered to come by for a beer. I said sure. When he arrived, I watched him, really watched him, and noticed something I'd been too distracted to see before. He asked about Paige with a slightly different quality than usual. Not concerned. More like checking a variable. I store that too. That night the nightmare was the worst yet. A firebase in the Karengal and Paige's voice coming through the radio, calm and clinical, reading coordinates I didn't recognize. I woke up at 3 a.m. with my heart hammering and the screenshots burning in my memory like an afterimage. I knew now. I knew the scale of it, the length of it, the depth of it. The question was no longer what happened. The question was what I was going to do about it, and how I was going to protect Aiden while I did. Doug Farrell showed up at my door on a Thursday evening with a six-pack and the look of a man who'd rehearsed what he was going to say on the drive over. I let him in. We sat on the back porch the way we always did, beers on the railing, the November air sharp enough to keep you honest. I watched him settle into his chair and waited to see which version of Doug had come tonight, the friend or the one with an agenda. He opened with the usual warm-up. Work, weather, a story about his truck needing new brakes. Then, after his second beer, he got to the point. "Paige called me," he said, not looking at me. "She's pretty broken up, Gil." I kept my eyes on the tree line at the back of the yard. "I know. She says you're not talking to her, that you've basically shut down." He turned to look at me then, his expression carefully assembled into concern. "Look, man, I've been where you are. When my marriage fell apart, I went dark for 3 months and nearly lost everything I had left. I'm not saying what she did was okay, but shutting her out completely isn't going to help you or Aiden. She reached out to you," I said. Not an accusation. A fact. Doug shifted in his seat. "She's scared, Gil. She doesn't want to lose her family. She should have thought about that before." I took a slow drink. "Did she tell you how long it's been going on?" A pause that lasted just a beat too long. "She mentioned it was recent." It wasn't recent. I set my bottle down on the railing and looked at him directly. "It goes back to January, Doug, before my February training cycle, which means it was running while I was sitting right here, thinking my marriage was intact." Something moved across his face, not surprise, more like recalibration. And right there, in that micro-expression, I got my answer to the question I'd been sitting with all week. Doug knew more than he was saying. How much more? I didn't know yet. But the tell was there, clean as a misfire. "I'm going to see someone," I said, letting the previous thread drop deliberately. "A therapist. Army connected one to me a while back. Figure it was time." Doug relaxed visibly at the subject change. That's good, man. That's really good. Maybe you and Paige could do couple therapy too. Work through this together. I nodded like I was considering it. I wasn't. The therapist's name was Dr. Raymond Coble, a former Army psychologist out of Fort Bragg who'd moved to private practice in Raleigh. I'd been referred to him twice before and never followed through. I called him the morning after Doug's visit and got an appointment within the week. Coble was a trim, serious man in his late 50s who didn't waste time on pleasantries. We sat across from each other in his sparse office, and I laid out the situation the way I'd brief a commander. Timeline, facts, current status. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want from this process, Gilbert? Because that determines everything." "I want to know if I drove her to it," I said. "I want an honest assessment." He leaned forward slightly. "Your PTSD made you difficult to live with. That's likely true, and it's something we can work on. But being a difficult husband does not create an obligation to deceive someone. Those are two separate problems. One belongs to you. The other one belongs entirely to her." He paused. "Don't let anyone, including your own guilt, fold those two things into one." It was the clearest thing anyone had said to me in weeks. I held on to it. But then he said the part that complicated everything. "If you're asking whether I think you should pursue reconciliation, I think it's premature to close that door. People in crisis make choices they wouldn't otherwise make. Therapy can create real change." I drove home with two contradictory truths sitting beside me in the cab of the truck. Coble was right on both counts. The man who told me not to absorb her guilt, and the man who asked me not to close the door yet. They were the same man, giving me two answers that pulled in opposite directions. That night I sat in Aiden's doorway for a while after he fell asleep, watching him breathe. He was sprawled across his bed with one arm hanging off the edge the way he'd slept since he was 3 years old. His baseball glove was on the nightstand. His NASA poster was on the wall. I felt the weight of everything settling into something solid and purposeful. Not anger anymore. Not grief. Something colder and more useful. Whatever I decided about Paige, whatever path this took, Aiden was not going to be collateral damage. He was not going to be a bargaining chip, a sympathy prop, or a casualty. I would make sure of that. And if Paige thought she could use him to soften me, she was about to find out exactly how wrong she was. The nightmare that came later that night was the worst of the series. Fallujah streets, but the buildings had our home's layout. The kitchen at the end of the alley, Aiden's room behind a blown-out doorway, and Paige's voice on a radio somewhere, saying he uses his past as an excuse. I woke up at 2:47, sat on the edge of the bed, and wrote everything I remembered down in a notebook I'd started keeping on the nightstand. Dr. Coble had suggested that. Said the writing creates distance between the dreamer and the dream. That if you can describe something, you can start to control your relationship with it. I wrote for 20 minutes. Then I closed the notebook, got dressed, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Because the next phase of this required a clear head. And I was done letting the past ambush the present. The call from Ms. Patricia Owens came on a Monday morning while I was between sessions at the range. I almost let it go to voicemail. The number was the school's main line, and my first instinct was a scheduling thing, an early pickup request, something administrative. But something made me answer. "Mr. Dixon," she said, her voice measured and careful. "I'm glad I caught you. I was hoping we could find time to talk this week. About Aiden. In person, if possible." I told her I could be there by 3:15. Ms. Owens was in her mid-40s, the kind of teacher who'd been doing it long enough to stop being surprised by anything, but hadn't let that turn her into someone who stopped noticing. She had Aiden's desk drawings spread on her table when I came in, not as decoration, as evidence. "He's a bright kid," she began, sliding one drawing toward me. "And usually he's one of the most engaged students in the room. But for the past 3 weeks, something shifted." I looked at the drawing. A house. A stick figure of a boy standing outside it, separate from 2 adult figures inside who faced away from each other. Even a child's hand tells the truth when a mind stops censoring. He told another student that his mom and dad don't talk anymore. Ms. Owens continued, watching me carefully. And last Friday, during free writing, he wrote a paragraph about a boy whose family was going to split in half. She let that sit. I'm not in the business of making assumptions about what happens at home, but I am in the business of noticing when a child is carrying something too heavy for him. I kept my voice steady. "I appreciate you calling me directly." She nodded. I want you to know, and I mean this genuinely, Aiden talks about you with a lot of pride. His dad teaches people to be safe. That's almost a direct quote. A brief, kind smile. Whatever is happening at home, that relationship is important. Don't let it become a casualty of whatever the adults in the room are working through. I drove home with her words pressing down on me alongside everything else. That evening, Paige was at the house when I got back. She'd been coming by daily under the pretense of seeing Aiden, which I hadn't prevented because I wasn't about to use my son as a blockade. But tonight something was different. She was on the phone in the kitchen, and when she heard me come in, she turned away and lowered her voice. I moved through the hallway quietly, not sneaking, just not announcing myself, and caught enough. He doesn't know the full picture yet, she was saying. I just need a little more time before things get legal. Yes, Bryce, I know. I know. I stepped into the kitchen doorway. She spun around, phone dropping to her side. Her face went through the full sequence. Caught, recalculating, choosing an expression. Talking to your attorney? I asked pleasantly. The slight hesitation told me everything. Just a friend. Right.
She's in his house seeing his son and still lying straight to his face, and Gilbert doesn't explode. He just files it away and keeps moving. That kind of discipline is rare. Most men would have lost it right there.
I set my range bag down and opened the refrigerator. Aiden's teacher called me today. Ms. Owens. She's worried about him. I turned around and looked at Paige directly. He drew a picture of himself standing outside the family house while his parents stand inside with their backs to each other. Fourth-grade kid. Wants to make sense of his world. Paige's composure slipped, and for one unguarded second, I saw genuine pain there. Not performance, not manipulation. Real. Whatever she'd done, she loved Aiden. I had no doubt about that. We have to tell him something, she said, her voice quieter now. We will, I agreed. When we have something honest to tell him. Not before. I leaned against the counter. And Paige, I heard the name. Don't bring Bryce Steele into the same calls where you discuss this family's future. That's not a request. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she picked up her purse and left without another word. I went upstairs and knocked on Aiden's door. He was at his desk with headphones on, some documentary about the space program running on his tablet. He pulled the headphones down and looked up at me. Hey, bud, I said. How was school? Okay. He shrugged, then added, almost carefully, Ms. Owens said she called you. She did. I sat on the edge of his bed. She thinks you're pretty great, by the way. Told me you said your dad teaches people to be safe. I kept my voice easy, watching his face. That true. The corner of his mouth turned up. Maybe. I reached over and ruffled his hair. Whatever's going on with the grown-up stuff, that's not on you. You understand me? None of it. He nodded, but his eyes were too serious for a 10-year-old. He was carrying it anyway, the way kids do, quietly and without complaint. I stayed until he fell asleep that night, long after he'd stopped pretending to watch the documentary. And I made myself a promise in that room, in the dark, with the quiet certainty of a man who has run out of room for compromise. No one was going to use my son as a weapon. Not Paige, not her lawyer, not anyone. I just needed to make sure that when the time came, I was the one holding all the cards. I spent 4 days building it quietly, the way you build anything that has to hold weight. Dr. Coble had told me not to close doors prematurely. Doug had told me to consider reconciliation. Paige had been calling every other day, her voicemails cycling through remorse, patience, and occasional flashes of pressure disguised as concern for Aiden. I let all of it accumulate without responding, because I needed her to believe she still had leverage. A cornered person acts unpredictably. A person who thinks they're winning gets comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. I called Paige on a Wednesday evening and told her I was ready to talk seriously, that I'd been seeing Dr. Coble, that he'd encouraged me to keep the door open, that maybe we owed it to Aiden to at least try counseling before making permanent decisions. I kept my voice measured, a little tired, a little hopeful, exactly the tone of a man who'd been beaten down enough to consider backing off. She believed it immediately. That told me something. I'm so glad you called, she said, and the relief in her voice was genuine. I've been going out of my mind, Gilbert. I've missed you. I've missed us. I know, I said. Me too. 2 days later I called Doug, told him the same story, that I was softening, that Coble had helped me see things differently, that I was thinking about giving the marriage another shot. I added one specific detail, that I decided not to pursue any of the information I'd received about Bryce, that I was going to let it go and focus on rebuilding. Doug's response was warm, encouraging, brotherly. He told me it took a strong man to choose forgiveness over pride. Then I waited. The next day, I had a contact, a former student of mine, a county sheriff's deputy named Aaron Briggs, who owed me a favor from a certification course I'd run for his department. Run a quiet background check on Bryce Steele. What came back confirmed what the informant had suggested. Bryce had been named in a workplace complaint 18 months prior at a different company. The complaint had been filed by a female employee and quietly settled. There was also a restraining order application from 3 years ago, withdrawn before it became active, but filed. This man had a pattern, and Paige was in the middle of it. That same afternoon, Paige called me, her voice different, brighter almost. She mentioned she'd run into Doug for coffee. Mentioned it casually, the way you mention something you want to land naturally. She said Doug thought it was great that I was coming around, that it meant a lot to him. There it was. Doug had gone straight to Paige within 24 hours of my call. He hadn't done it to help me. He'd done it to update her, which meant he was feeding information back to her side of this, and possibly to Bryce as well. My closest friend had been running a secondary channel this whole time, right under my nose. I filed it and kept moving. The inward peace, the one I hadn't fully resolved, was still there. Late at night, in the quiet, the doubt still came. Whether my PTSD had hollowed something out of the marriage that she'd tried and failed to fill with me before going elsewhere. Dr. Coble had addressed it plainly. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it stop burning are two different things. The nightmares hadn't quit. Paige's voice still showed up in the wrong geography, saying things she'd written to Bryce that she'd never said to my face. But I was clear on one thing now. Aiden was the perimeter. Everything else was negotiable. He was not. The following Friday, I asked Paige to come to the house for dinner. Told her I thought we should try being in the same room again. Take it slow. She arrived at 6, brought a bottle of wine she knew I liked, was dressed carefully but not overdressed. She was managing the impression, same as always. We ate at the kitchen table while Aiden watched a movie in the living room, and the evening had the surface texture of normalcy. After Aiden was in bed, I sat across from her at the table and said, quietly, I need to know the whole timeline, Paige. All of it. Not the version you prepared. The real one. She hesitated. Then she said it had started in December, not January. A work dinner that ran long. December. Before my February training cycle by 2 full months. She'd been lying about the start date in every version of this conversation, which meant when she came to my door in tears the morning after the party, she'd already had the revised timeline ready. I let none of that show. Just nodded slowly, like the confirmation cost me something. Thank you for telling me, I said. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. I let her. I was done being surprised by what people showed me when they thought they were safe. Now I just need to let her keep talking. The call that changed everything came from Aaron Briggs on a Tuesday morning. I was at the range, early session, just me and the targets in the cold November quiet. My phone buzzed and I stepped outside the lane to take it. Gil, Aaron said, his voice carrying the specific flatness of a man about to say something he wishes he didn't have to. I did a little more digging on Steele after that background poll. You're going to want to hear this in person. We met at a diner off Capitol Boulevard at noon. Aaron slid a manila folder across the table before he'd even picked up his coffee. Inside were printed records, phone logs, a second workplace complaint that had never made it to HR officially, and a printed series of screenshots that someone had sent to the sheriff's department tip line anonymously 2 weeks ago. The screenshots were from Bryce Steele's phone. The source had clearly had access to it. I recognized the handwriting of the situation immediately. The informant who'd texted me, the same one who'd gone dark, had also sent a package to law enforcement. They'd been working multiple angles simultaneously, and the tip line gave them the anonymity the direct contact to me hadn't. The screenshots showed Bryce discussing Paige in a group thread with 2 other men. The conversation was degrading in the specific, calculated way of men who view women as transactions. There was also a message chain between Bryce and someone whose number was saved only as a letter, D, that made my jaw tighten. The exchanges referenced Paige by name, discussed her home situation, discussed me. D, 1 letter. I looked at Aaron across the table. The letter D, I said. Did anyone trace that number? Aaron tapped the folder. Registered to a prepaid. But the content, specific references to your address, your schedule at the range, your February training dates, that's not information a stranger would have. Doug Farrell had known my February training dates. He'd helped me arrange coverage for the range while I was gone. I sat with that for a moment. A long moment. What do the police do with the tip line material? I asked. Right now, nothing actionable. But if additional evidence comes in corroborating the workplace complaint pattern, and if a named party were to submit a formal statement, it changes the picture considerably. He met my eyes. I'm telling you this as a friend, Gil. Not officially. I thanked him, drove back to the range, and sat in my truck for a while. The informant had been playing this from multiple directions. Whoever they were, their motive wasn't purely altruistic. They wanted Bryce Steele accountable, and they'd identified me as the most motivated person to help make that happen. They'd used me, yes, but they'd also handed me everything I needed. That evening, I texted the informant's number again. Still dark. Then I tried one more time and wrote, I know about the tip line. I know about D. I'm not angry, but I need to know who you are before I make my next move. If you want Steele to actually face consequences, you need me to know the full picture. 20 minutes passed. Then, his name is Ryan Hollis. Paige isn't the first. My sister was the one before her. He did the same thing. The money, the gifts, the pressure, waiting until the husband looked like the unstable one. Then he moved on and left the wreckage behind. I wanted him to pay for it through someone who had the standing to make it stick. That someone is you.
The informant had his own reasons, his own wounds, but sometimes the people who hand you the truth are carrying their own scars. What matters is what you do with it, and Gilbert knew exactly what to do.
There it was. The complete picture. I typed back. I have it. Don't disappear again. This time the reply came immediately. I won't. I called Aaron that night and told him I wanted to make a formal statement regarding the workplace complaint pattern and submit supporting documentation. He said he'd arrange it. Then I sat down and wrote Doug Farrell a text. Short, simple. We need to talk. Tomorrow. My place. He replied within minutes. Of course. Everything okay? I looked at that message for a long time. Then I typed. Not really. But will be. The trap I'd built over 3 weeks had done exactly what it was designed to do. I hadn't exploded. Hadn't threatened anyone. Hadn't given Paige or Doug or Bryce a single reason to see me coming. I'd gathered. I confirmed. I connected the wires. Now it was time to close the circuit. The mediation session was set for a Thursday morning in early December. A conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Raleigh office building with a view of the skyline and the kind of neutral, beige stillness that's designed to keep people from breaking things. Paige arrived with her attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Carla Dunning, who moved through the room like she owned the square footage. My attorney was a man named Frank Idelson, former litigation partner, now family law, the kind of person who said very little and made every word count. I'd retained him the week after Aaron Briggs handed me the folder. I sat across the table from Paige and waited. She looked tired in a way that ran deeper than sleep debt. The previous 2 weeks had not been kind to her, and I could see in the set of her jaw the careful stillness she was maintaining. Beside me, Idelson had his documents organized in 3 neat stacks. Dunning opened by proposing a standard asset split, joint custody with a structured schedule, no fault assignment. Civil and efficient. The language of people trying to minimize damage. Idelson let her finish. Then he set the first stack of documents in the center of the table. Before we discuss the standard framework, he said calmly, I'd like to introduce some materials that bear on the question of primary custody. Dunning glanced at the stack. What materials? Documentation of an extramarital relationship that began in December of last year, predating Mr. Dixon's last reserve training cycle by 2 months, along with financial transfer records indicating material support from the third party, and corroborated testimony regarding the third party's prior behavioral pattern in comparable situations. Idelson folded his hands. Additionally, communications in which Mrs. Dixon discussed using the couple's minor child as a factor in post-separation leverage. The room went very still. Paige's eyes came to me across the table, and what I saw in them wasn't anger. It was the look of someone who had underestimated the terrain and was now calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Those communications were private, Dunning said, her voice sharpening. They were documented. Idelson replied evenly. There's a distinction. What followed was 2.5 hours of careful, structured dismantling. Dunning was good. She pushed back on the admissibility of several items, challenged the sourcing, tried to redirect the conversation toward my PTSD as a custody factor. Idelson addressed each point methodically without raising his voice once. I let him work, kept my own expression neutral, and spoke only when directly asked. The PTSD angle was the one I'd prepared for most carefully. Idelson introduced Dr. Cobal's professional assessment, submitted with Cobal's consent, which outlined my treatment progress, functional stability, and concluded that there was no clinical basis for limiting my parenting role. Dunning tried twice more and let it go the second time. By the end of the session, the joint custody framework remained, but primary physical residence was shifted to me. The structured schedule favored Aiden's stability over convenience. The financial settlement was equitable. There was no clause about Bryce Steele. I hadn't pursued legal action against him directly, because Aaron's formal submission had already set its own consequences in motion regarding the workplace complaint. That wasn't my fight to run. It was running itself. When it was over and the attorneys were gathering papers, Paige stood and looked at me across the table for a long moment. The performance was gone. All of it. What was left was just a woman who had made choices she couldn't undo, standing in the full weight of that. "I didn't think you had all of it," she said quietly. Not accusatory, just honest, maybe for the first time. "I know," I replied. That was the point. She nodded once, picked up her bag, and walked out with her attorney. I watched her go, then turned and looked out the window at the Raleigh skyline for a minute before Idelson touched my arm and said we were done. That afternoon, I picked Aiden up from school myself. He came out the front doors in his jacket, backpack bouncing, and spotted me leaning against the truck. His face did the thing it did, the grin that started slow and then took over completely. "You're early," he said. "Finished work," I told him. "Figured we'd get burgers." He threw his backpack in the truck bed and climbed in. We drove to his favorite place on Falls of Noose Road, sat in a corner booth, and talked about his baseball team's off-season practice schedule and a documentary about the Apollo program he wanted to watch over the weekend. I let him talk as long as he wanted. At one point, he got quiet for a second, fiddling with the paper wrapper from a straw. Then he looked up. "Are you and Mom going to be okay? Like, are you going to be okay?" I looked at my son, at the seriousness in his face, the gap-toothed kid who read about space and kept his glove on his nightstand and had been carrying questions too heavy for a 10-year-old since October. "Yeah, bud," I said. "We're both going to be okay. Different okay than before, but okay." He considered that with the gravity it deserved. Then he nodded and went back to his burger, apparently satisfied with the answer. I drove home with him asleep in the passenger seat before we hit the driveway, and I sat in the parked truck for a while, engine off, listening to him breathe. Whatever it had cost to get here, and it had cost a great deal, this was worth it. This specific, quiet, ordinary moment was worth every calculated step. 3 months later, the house was different. Not dramatically, no grand renovation, no symbolic repainting of walls, but different in the way a space feels when the source of tension has been removed and what remains has room to breathe. Aiden's baseball gear was in the mudroom. His NASA poster had migrated from his bedroom to the kitchen, at his request. The refrigerator had a schedule on it, his games, my range sessions, the alternating weekends with Paige that had settled into a functional, if cool, co-parenting arrangement. Paige had moved into an apartment on the north side of the city. She called on schedule, picked Aiden up on her weekends, maintained the surface civility of people who shared a child and a history, and had agreed not to make either one a casualty. It wasn't warmth, but it was workable, and workable was what Aiden needed. Bryce Steele had left the IT company by November, before the mediation. The workplace complaint Aaron Briggs had formally submitted, combined with the tip line material Ryan Hollis had provided, had generated an HR investigation that Bryce apparently decided not to wait out. He was gone before anyone served him anything. Whether that constituted justice was a philosophical question I wasn't interested in spending energy on. He was out of our lives. That was sufficient. Doug Farrell I hadn't spoken to since the morning he came to my door, and I told him, without drama, that I knew what he'd done and that we were finished. He'd tried to explain, said he'd convinced himself he was staying neutral, that he hadn't intended harm. I told him intention and impact aren't the same thing, and closed the door. I didn't hate him. I just had no use for him anymore. Ryan Hollis had sent one final message in late November. After the mediation, I heard things move the way they should. My sister is doing better. I hope you're too. I thanked him, wished him well, and the line went quiet. Somewhere out there was a man who'd used my situation to settle his own score and had accidentally done me a service. I could hold both of those things at once without needing to resolve them. Dr. Coble and I were still meeting every other week. The nightmares had thinned. They hadn't stopped. I was realistic enough not to expect them to stop entirely. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But they'd changed in texture. Less command. Less Page's voice in the wrong geography. More just memory, which was a thing I could work with. One evening in late January, I was on the back porch with a cup of coffee. Same chair I'd sat in with Doug on that October night. That felt like a different era. The yard was frost-edged and still, the kind of cold that clarifies everything it touches. Aiden slid open the back door and came out in his socks, which I told him immediately was a bad idea. Just for a second, he said, and stood beside my chair looking out the yard. Dad, yeah. When I'm older and stuff gets hard, he started, then stopped, reformulating. How do you know when to keep fighting for something versus when to just let it go? I thought about it, gave it the respect the question deserved. You pay attention, I said finally, to what the thing is actually costing you, and who else is paying the cost. If you're the only one in it and it's eating you alive, that's information. I looked at him. And you don't let anyone convince you that hanging on when you should let go is the same as being strong. Sometimes the strongest move is the clean cut. He absorbed that with the focus quiet he brought to things that mattered to him. Then he nodded, said his feet were freezing, and went back inside. I stayed out a little longer. The thing Dr. Coble had said that stuck with me most, the one I turned over regularly, was about trust. That betrayal of this kind doesn't just damage the relationship it happens in. It rewires the way a man reads every relationship afterward. Makes you scan for exits. Makes you catalog inconsistencies. Makes the baseline assumption shift from safety to threat. He was right. I felt that daily. The ability to simply believe someone without analyzing the subtext. That was gone, or at least deeply altered. I didn't know if it was coming back in its original form. I suspected it wasn't. But I also knew this. I was still standing. I had my son. I had my work, which I was good at, and which meant something. I had a therapist who was honest with me, a legal outcome that protected Aiden, and a clear picture of exactly who had been in my corner and who hadn't. That wasn't everything I'd had in October, but it was real. Every piece of it was real. And after months of living inside a carefully constructed lie, real was the only thing that still felt like solid ground. I finished my coffee, went inside, and locked the back door. Tomorrow Aiden had practice. I'd be there early, the way I always was.
This isn't just a story about relationships. It's about a man who came home wounded and was met with deception instead of loyalty. The hardest part, he spent months wondering if it was his own fault. That self-doubt is the cruelest part of betrayal. But Gilbert didn't let the anger consume him. He got focused, protected his son, and acted with discipline instead of rage. And that's what won. Loyalty isn't optional, and men who hold the line, even when everything is falling apart, deserve to be heard. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.